Okay, so today is Wednesday, October 4th, 2023. This is the Stronghold Digital Mining Daily Update. My name's Steven Zeiner. I have yet to dive into comments here on YouTube in actually several days. So I do plan to catch up with your comments in the next 24 to 48 hours. It's just been one of those situations where I like responding with more than just a word or a thumbs up. So, and sometimes that takes a little bit of thought and a little bit more time to be able to do that. Oh my gosh, this is it. Okay. Wow, what do I do? This is a test of the national. Okay. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so that was a test of the National Wireless Emergency Alert System. I thought that Stronghold Digital Mining might have announced something pretty momentous there for a moment. In any event, apologies for that. I am going to catch up with comments. I apologize for not being a bit more on top of that, but I will get on top of that relatively soon here. Gosh, that was really loud, wasn't it? Anyway, let me just sort of collect my thoughts again. That was quite jolting. So, speaking of jolting, speaking of something that just kind of is sort of like in the back of your mind, because I kind of knew that alert was supposed to happen today. I just kind of lost track of time. The halving, right? The Bitcoin halving is probably going to take place in about 6 months, maybe 7 months at the outside. So basically, we're looking at maybe like mid to late April of 2024, potentially early May. It sort of depends. Our revenue from our Bitcoin mining operations, right? If nothing else changes, let's say the Bitcoin network hash rate stays the same. Let's assume Bitcoin, which is trading around roughly $27,500 per coin, let's assume that's still trading at the same price. If like none of those other key variables change, essentially we're going to see a situation where all of our Bitcoin mining revenue gets cut in half. Thus, right, the phrase the halving. The Bitcoin mining rewards that we're otherwise collecting now, right, which I think amount, if my recollection is correct, I think it's about like 900 Bitcoin per day are being allocated by the system. That gets cut to about 450 once the halving takes place. So, our proportional portion of that reward, gets cut in half. I mean, to keep it really simple, just look at hash price. Okay, whatever hash price is right now, just imagine that number being cut in half. It's a big deal. Now, if history is any guide, the price of Bitcoin will likely enter into a bull market. I mean, certainly, right now, who's selling Bitcoin, really? Probably publicly traded Bitcoin mining companies, maybe all Bitcoin mining companies, or most of them. Because, right, these companies, including Stronghold Digital Mining, need the revenue that's generated by selling the Bitcoin that are being mined to help fund operations. Tell me of a publicly traded Bitcoin mining company that is generating free cash flow that's also keeping their Bitcoin and is able to do that successfully. I'm not aware of any. Right? And to the extent a company is doing that, in the one or two instances I've seen, I see lines of credit, 50 some odd million here, there, it's like the money has to come from somewhere to fund day-to-day operations. So when I think about something that's kind of jolting and, somewhat startling, well, the halving is something that we know is going to happen. So it's going to pose a challenge. On the other hand, we I think have a fair sense of confidence that a United States-based spot Bitcoin ETF is not guaranteed to be approved by the US Securities and Exchange Commission, but certainly has a high likelihood of being approved by the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. It's interesting to me at some level, right, that in the land of the free, so many things need to be regulated, right? I mean, this isn't like a medical device or an ingestible, right? This is just, hey, it's a financial instrument through which people can, gain exposure to something called Bitcoin. So while I respect and appreciate that there is a very, very rigorous regulatory environment to protect investors, I do sometimes wonder at some level if that level of regulatory, scrutiny is sometimes helpful, or if it sometimes attempts to solve a problem that has already occurred, right? That old saying, once the so-called horses have left the barn, then there's an effort to sort of secure and close the barn doors. But of course, the horses have already galloped away. And there is sometimes a tendency to try to solve the last problem that took place, right? Rather than, potentially attempting to solve future problems. But then the question arises, well, in a supposedly free market, isn't the opportunity, right? Isn't the opportunity to figure out, what might make the most sense up to the market, up to individuals, up to institutions? So anyway, I do think that there is a very strong likelihood that after vigorous review, after thorough analysis, after, a real, genuine sort of like review of these various spot Bitcoin ETFs, I think there's a high likelihood that these instruments, right, these ETFs, these exchange traded funds will be deemed to be safe. They're safe. They're safe for people to put money in, right? And once that happens, you'll still get a disclosure that's probably 80 pages long, outlining all the risks and uncertainties associated with putting money into an exchange traded fund. But nonetheless, it'll be available, right? So that's going to prove, I think, to potentially be a really strong tailwind for the entire Bitcoin ecosystem. So if the halving represents a headwind, specifically more for Bitcoin miners, arguably the approval of a spot Bitcoin ETF here in the United States could very well be a tailwind, right? Something that really helps the industry, specifically the publicly traded Bitcoin mining industry. Why? Because the price of Bitcoin arguably has the opportunity to really go up in price if we do see a flood of capital into Bitcoin as a result of an ETF, which essentially plugs Bitcoin somewhat more, easily into Wall Street, so to speak. Okay, so maybe those two things balance themselves out. What else might be a jolting sort of experience? Well, a financial crisis here in the United States is something that arguably has never really happened in a true sense since the creation of Bitcoin. Bitcoin, one might argue, was created in response to the previous really large, significant financial crisis, right? The so-called 2008 financial crisis. And so it's interesting to me that we may very likely, find ourselves in another financial crisis, potentially precipitated by, hey, interest rates being sky high. Hey, let this go on maybe another month or so. How many more banks have the potential to fail here in the United States, right? As a result of that, what is to be made of, and this could happen at any moment, right? Where suddenly there's a realization that US Treasuries, right, which are typically viewed as a risk-free instrument into which to put money, what if there's a sense, not just in the United States, but really globally, that Uncle Sam, which is something of a colloquialism for the US federal government, right, that Uncle Sam is really in a bit of trouble when it comes to his finances. Uncle Sam is spending way more money than what he actually brings in, right, in the form of taxes. And so to the extent we continue to have these massive, and by massive, I don't mean, hey, a couple $1 billion. I mean like, 2, maybe 3 or more $1 trillion per year right, in federal budget deficits, I mean, there's a strong argument to be made that a lot of that excess spending will get monetized by the U.S. Federal Reserve, which in turn means an expansion of the money supply, inflation. So, that arguably can be a tailwind for Bitcoin if, but only if, Bitcoin rises to the occasion and proves itself to be a substitute, or at least a high beta sort of like alternative to gold, or to something like gold. One can make, I think, a very cogent set of arguments, technical arguments, as to why Bitcoin might be superior to gold. But I've yet to see a bunch of central banks buying gold, buying Bitcoin. But I've seen them, or at least I've read, I haven't seen them physically, but I've read that various central banks have been accumulating more gold. So, we're going to get into, I think, a real world test of whether or not Bitcoin is going to be a safe haven. Hey, look, at the end of the day, if Bitcoin is a risk on, wildly speculative, beanie baby frenzy type digital, token that is otherwise kind of meaningless aside from some sort of like gambling tool, well then, hey, then the market's going to respond to that, and we may not see Bitcoin anymore, right? But to the extent the market really does begin to say, hey, wait, we do need to put money into something which we believe is a true store of value, right? Not just a tokenized beanie baby, right, so to speak. Then Bitcoin's going to have to step up into that role. And I'm not saying that gold's going to go to zero in terms of its market cap. Of course not, right? Of course not. But hey, if Bitcoin right now has a market cap of about 500 billion, and if it's true, I don't know for sure if this is or isn't, but if it's true that gold, by contrast, has a market capitalization upwards of 12 trillion, okay, then, would it be reasonable to see Bitcoin have a market cap that maybe approaches, instead of 500 billion, maybe just a mere 3 trillion? Would that be appropriate? Would we see that as, hey, we're making progress in the right direction? Maybe 5 trillion, right? I'm not saying gold has to go away, but I think we do have to start seeing something, right, in the market that will help, I think, guide sort of like a belief, right, a true belief, right, that, hey, Bitcoin really can act as a store of value and not just be this wildly phenomenal, hey, up, a bazillion percent since its inception, wildly speculative, volatile thing that we speak of as a store of value, but has yet to really be tested in a significant, meaningful way as a store of value. I think we're going to get that test pretty soon. Because one way or the other, regardless of one's, sort of like governmental philosophies or whatnot, I think from a mathematics perspective, I don't know how sustainable some of the things we're seeing with regard to Uncle Sam and Uncle Sam's finances. I don't know how sustainable some of that is. And at what point do we really start to see not just cracks, but actual fractures, like really like earthquakes, right, within the US financial system? And what will become of Bitcoin at that point, right? What are we going to see? And I think all of these things are coming together kind of at the same time. Not predicting, the end of the world tomorrow, but I'm just saying, hey, there's a halving that we know for sure is going to happen in about 6 months, maybe 7 months. We know that for sure. The approval of a US-based spot Bitcoin ETF, I think there's a high probability of it. There's no guarantee of it. That's likely to happen, if it's going to happen, within the next 6 months or so. It's just, again, the mathematics of the timing as to when these applications were filed. There's a certain legal deadline by which the US Securities Exchange Commission has to make a decision. They can extend that decision only so far, right? At some point, they have to make a decision. Yay or nay? What's going to happen? So we're going to get some results, some answer relatively soon, probably in the next 6 months, if not sooner, much sooner. As for a real breakdown in U.S. financial markets, remember the thing, right? The real issue here is U.S. Federal Reserve. They've been acting incredibly responsibly, right? But the question is, how sustainable is that level of responsibility when Uncle Sam, which, arguably is supposed to let you be your own independent Federal Reserve, what happens when Uncle Sam, shows up hat in hand saying, hey, you got to help us out? They may not come out and say that right directly, but indirectly, what do you do? So I think historically there's an argument to be made that governments, regardless of government, that there's a tendency, a propensity to print the so-called trillions, right? And for there to be absolute and total currency debasement. It kind of sucks. I mean, I wish it weren't like that, but history, if it's to be any guide at all, would seem to suggest that that's a thing. So, I'm not, the goal here isn't to bet on systemic financial failures. Certainly in the case of Stronghold Digital Mining, right? I'm certainly not betting for bad weather or, grid issues that will cause all kinds of spikes in grid pricing at the expense of, human life or stuff like that. No, that's really not the goal here. But as a company, as individual co-owners, as shareholders of the business, we have no control over what Uncle Sam's doing, at least not really. We have no control over broader, sort of discussions by say the US Securities and Exchange Commission as to whether or not a Bitcoin ETF is going to be approved. We have certainly no say whatsoever as to whether or not a halving is going to occur. It's going to happen. So what we do have control over is our own operations, as I keep saying. And speaking of our operations, I suspect that either tomorrow or Friday, we're going to finally find out what our Bitcoin production numbers were for the month of September 2023. And there's at least a non-trivial chance that we'll hear a little bit more about the 25 megawatts of end-to-end data center equipment that we've already got. Right? Hey, where are we going to put that equipment? There's a non-trivial, non-zero chance that, better than nothing, right? Chance that we're going to hear maybe something about it. I'm not holding my breath. I think at a bare minimum, we'll find out how much Bitcoin production we had in September. I just think there's a chance we might find out a bit more, maybe, about this data center equipment. And if we don't, that's fine. We're certainly going to find out about it sooner or later, though. So, okay, until then, let's stay positive, let's be great, and we'll see each other again tomorrow.